For most Australians in September 1939, war was a distant concept, a European crisis echoing the headlines of 1914. Britain had declared war on Germany, and as a dominion of the Empire, Australia automatically followed. Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced on national radio that we were at war, but few imagined the conflict would one day tear the blue sky of the Pacific. Soldiers enlisted with almost naive enthusiasm, eager for adventure and ready to defend the old country. The economy quickly began to mobilize, but life in coastal cities like Sydney and Melbourne remained surprisingly normal. The real threat, it was believed, was confined to the fields of Europe. No one could predict that geography would no longer be a protection. The early years of the war saw Australians thrown into distant and brutal combat in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Heroes were forged at Tobruk and in Greece, where the legendary 9th Division held the line against Rommel. The myth of the resilient and resourceful Australian warrior grew with each war dispatch. However, in the corridors of power in Canberra, apprehension grew with the aggressive expansion of Imperial Japan into Asia. The fall of France in 1940 had already exposed Indochina, and now Japan eyed the resources of Southeast Asia. Australia, with its vulnerable and sparsely populated Northern Territory, began to sound silent alarms. Reliance on the British naval base at Singapore, considered impregnable, was the cornerstone of Australian defence strategy. It was a faith that would soon be tragically shattered. While England fought desperately against the German Blitz, Japan saw a golden opportunity to dominate the Pacific without interference from distracted European powers. For Australia, the danger ceased to be a theoretical possibility and became a matter of time. The government began recruiting and training local militias more earnestly, ordinary men who would become the chocos, ready to defend their homes. Daily life began to change. Nighttime blackouts were implemented in coastal cities, and rationing of fuel and textiles became stricter. Radios broadcast worrying news about the Japanese advances, but there was still an underlying confidence that Singapore would hold. After all, the British would never abandon their most loyal daughter in the Pacific. That assumption was about to collapse like a house of cards. The year 1941 ended with the world holding its breath. On December 7th, Hawaii local time, Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, devastating the American Pacific Fleet. The following day, Australia, the United States, and Britain were officially at war with Japan. Prime Minister John Curtin, who had taken office in October, now faced the darkest possible scenario. Mother England was too busy to rescue her distant daughter, and the United States was momentarily paralyzed. Australia was alone, its virgin beaches now at the mercy of the greatest naval power in the Pacific. The collective perception changed overnight. The war was no longer theirs, it was ours. It was knocking on our door. The next blow was swift and devastating. On December 10, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy sank the British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. It was the first time in history that moving battleships were sunk by air attack, and the psychological impact was immense. If the giants of the Royal Navy could be destroyed, what remained of the fortress of Singapore? For Australia, it was a mortal warning that Japanese air and naval power was unstoppable at that moment. The vital maritime supply routes for Australian trade and defence were now completely exposed. The myth of British protection was dissolving in the smoke of burning ships. For the first time, Australians looked to the horizon and saw not a friendly ocean, but a highway for the invade. Meanwhile, in northern Australia, a growing anxiety gripped small communities. In Darwin, a strategic port and crucial military base, the tropical routine concealed a palpable tension. Radios picked up Japanese transmissions, and reconnaissance aircraft were occasionally sighted, fueling paranoia. The government ordered the evacuation of women and children from Darwin and other northern areas, now considered the front line. Families were separated, and men stayed behind, armed with obsolete rifles and fierce determination. The once peaceful landscape of the top end began to transform into a potential battlefield. The red soil, crocodile swamps, and dense vegetation were no longer just exotic outback, they were the last barrier before the heart of the continent. January 1942 witnessed the unstoppable Japanese advance. They took Manila, invaded Borneo and Celebes, and their troops moved down the Malayan Peninsula towards Singapore. For Australians, the war now had names of nearby places. Rabaul, in New Britain, became a crucial Japanese airbase after lightning invasion. The heroic Australian defenders at Rabaul were quickly overwhelmed, many becoming prisoners of war who would suffer unspeakable horrors. News of the fall of Rabaul hit the population like a bomb. The outer ring of defence was broken, and Japan was now comfortably positioned to attack Australia directly. The country realised, with a chill down its spine, that the war was no longer a matter of if, but when the invasion would occur. The most emblematic message of Australian desperation came from Prime Minister John Curtin himself. On December 27, 1941, he published a historic article in the Herald newspaper, declaring that Australia looked to America, free of any pangs or complex about traditional links with Britain. It was a political and emotional earthquake. Curtin stated clearly that Australia would not be a mere pawn on the British chessboard, and that the alliance with the United States was the key to national survival. The declaration was met with fury by Winston Churchill, but resonated deeply with the Australian people, who felt the abandonment. It was the official recognition that the old order had crumbled and that, to survive, Australia needed to forge its own path alongside a new power. As diplomacy reshaped itself, military preparations at home intensified frantically. Civil defence orders were issued: dig trenches in parks, install sandbags in public buildings, and paint car headlights to reduce visibility. In Sydney, anti-aircraft guns were installed at strategic points like the cliffs of Bondi and the heights of Bradley's Head. Men aged 18 to 45 were conscripted into the militia, training with sticks and wooden guns due to equipment shortages. The civilian population was instructed on how to act in case of air raid or invasion. The peaceful routine of Australian life was replaced by a feeling of imminent siege, a tightness in the chest that united everyone in a common and terrifying purpose. February 1942 brought the final disaster everyone feared. On February 15th, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered to the Japanese. Over 15,000 Australian soldiers were taken prisoner, along with tens of thousands of British and Indian troops. The humiliation and tragedy were total. The barrier protecting Australia had fallen without offering the expected resistance, and the Japanese were now just a hop away from the Indonesian archipelago and New Guinea. What followed was an exodus of fear and silent panic. The northern coasts of Australia were now open, and the entire nation waited, with nerves on edge, for the enemy's next move. The war was no longer just approaching. It had arrived on Australia's doorstep, ready to break down the door at any moment. The fall of Singapore sent shockwaves through every Australian home, but there was no time for mourning as the Japanese war machine pressed forward with terrifying speed. In the days following the surrender, Japanese forces swept through the Dutch East Indies, capturing oil-rich Borneo and the strategic island of Sumatra with little resistance. The archipelago that had always been Australia's protective buffer zone was now being transformed into a launching pad for invasion. Refugee ships began arriving in northern Australian ports, carrying terrified civilians and wounded soldiers who spoke of Japanese brutality and seemingly unstoppable momentum. Their haunted eyes and horrific stories spread like wildfire through the population, confirming the worst fears of what was coming. The war was no longer a distant radio broadcast. It was a living nightmare approaching by land and sea. On February 19, 1942, the nightmare finally materialized over the Australian continent itself. At 9:58 in the morning, 188 Japanese carrier-based aircraft appeared in the clear blue sky above Darwin Harbour. The town's air raid sirens wailed too late as bombs began raining down on the unsuspecting city and its crowded harbour, where dozens of Allied ships lay at anchor. For 40 minutes, the attack continued with surgical precision, sinking 8 ships including the American destroyer USS Perry and destroying 23 aircraft. More bombs fell on Darwin that day than had fallen on Pearl Harbor just 10 weeks earlier, yet this attack would remain Australia's best-kept wartime secret for decades. The official death toll was suppressed, and the government imposed strict censorship to prevent panic across the nation. The first wave of bombers had barely disappeared when a second wave of 54 land-based attack aircraft arrived to complete the devastation. Oil tanks blazed uncontrollably, sending towering columns of black smoke visible for miles across the Timor Sea. Civilians who had been going about their ordinary morning routines now found themselves crawling through burning streets, pulling neighbors from collapsed buildings, and watching their city dissolve into chaos. Panic spread faster than the flames as hundreds of terrified residents fled Darwin in any vehicle they could find, creating a desperate exodus southward along the single 2-lane road. The government would later call it the Adelaide River Stakes, a shameful episode of mass evacuation that revealed just how unprepared Australia truly was. The bombing of Darwin was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a sustained air campaign against northern Australia that would continue for nearly 2 years. Over the following months, Japanese aircraft attacked Broome, Wyndham, Derby, Port Hedland, and even as far south as Exmouth Gulf. In March, Zero fighters strafed the small town of Broome, destroying 15 flying boats and killing dozens of refugees who had just arrived from the Dutch East Indies. The northern coastline, once considered a remote and peaceful frontier, had become a battleground where ordinary Australians faced the direct violence of war. Families huddled in makeshift shelters while Japanese aircraft flew overhead, searching for new targets in the vast, empty landscape below. As the air raids continued, Japanese submarines began operating along the eastern coast of Australia, bringing the war to the doorstep of Sydney and Newcastle. In late May and early June 1942, Japanese midget submarines infiltrated Sydney Harbour in one of the most audacious attacks of the Pacific War. Locals enjoying a Saturday night at venues like the King's Cross nightclubs had no idea that enemy vessels were silently navigating beneath the waters of their iconic harbour. When the attack came, it was sudden and violent. Torpedoes exploded against a converted ferry being used as a floating hostel, killing 21 sailors. The harbour, Australia's pride and symbol of security, had been violated by the enemy. The night of May 31, 1942, will forever be etched in Australian memory as the moment when war literally came to the nation's largest city. 3 Japanese midget submarines, launched from mother submarines waiting offshore, crept past the incomplete anti-submarine net at the harbour entrance under the cover of darkness. One became entangled in the net, its crew choosing to scuttle their vessel rather than surrender, becoming the first Japanese prisoners of the war in Australia. The other 2 pressed forward, evading patrol boats and depth charges before launching their torpedoes at the USS Chicago, which narrowly avoided destruction. The subsequent explosions rocked the harbour, shattering windows and sending civilians fleeing from waterfront restaurants in terror. In the aftermath of the Sydney Harbour attack, Australians realised that no corner of their continent was truly safe from Japanese reach. The submarine threat continued with attacks on merchant shipping along the coast, sinking vessels within sight of Sydney's beaches and Newcastle's steelworks. In June, a Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Newcastle and shelled the city's eastern suburbs, sending shells crashing into homes and harbour facilities. The industrial heart of Australia's war effort was now within range of enemy guns, forcing factories to operate under blackout conditions and constant fear of bombardment. Every night, families listened for the sound of approaching aircraft or the distant thunder of naval guns. While the coastlines faced direct attack, the jungles of New Guinea became the true testing ground for Australia's survival as a sovereign nation. Japanese forces had landed at Gunner and Buna on the northern coast of New Guinea, intent on crossing the Owen Stanley Range along the Kokoda Track to capture Port Moresby. If Port Moresby fell, Japanese bombers would be within range of Cairns and Townsville, opening the door for a full-scale invasion of the Australian mainland. The Kokoda Track, a brutal 96-kilometre pathway through some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth, would become the setting for one of the most desperate campaigns in Australian military history. Australian militia units, many barely trained and equipped with outdated weapons, were rushed across the Coral Sea to slow the Japanese advance along the Kokoda Track. These were the Chocos, the men who had been training with wooden guns and sticks just months earlier, now facing battle-hardened Japanese veterans in the fetid, leech-infested jungles of Papua. They fought with extraordinary courage under impossible conditions, holding the enemy at bay while suffering horrific casualties from combat and disease. Mud, rain, hunger, and exhaustion became their constant companions as they fell back step by step toward Imata Ridge, the last defensible position before Port Moresby. Behind the front lines, an extraordinary partnership was taking shape between Australian soldiers and the Papuan people who would become their lifeline. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, as they came to be known, carried wounded Australian soldiers back down the treacherous mountain track under enemy fire and through conditions that defied human endurance. These remarkable men and women carried stretchers over precipitous cliffs, through raging rivers, and across open grasslands where Japanese aircraft hunted them from above. Their compassion and courage saved hundreds of Australian lives and forged an unbreakable bond between two peoples fighting together against a common enemy. The war had created unlikely heroes in the most unlikely places. Back in Australia, the government finally acknowledged the existential threat by implementing total defence mobilisation and preparing for the worst-case scenario, invasion. Plans were drawn up for a scorched earth policy that would destroy everything of value to the enemy, from mining equipment to food supplies, as Australian forces retreated into the interior. The Brisbane Line strategy, though controversial, envisioned abandoning the northern and western parts of the continent to defend the more popular southeastern cities where the nation's industrial capacity was concentrated. Ordinary Australians began digging backyard trenches, stockpiling food, and preparing for the possibility that their homes would become battlefields in the very near future.